So my name is Tawanda Chimini. I am the Executive Director of the Election Resource Center, which is a think tank and advocacy organization working on democracy and elections in Zimbabwe. Part of our work includes advocating for electoral reforms across the election cycle, looking at legislation, looking at policies, looking at practices. It also includes mobilization for citizens to register to vote, to come out and to vote, and to engage those that they would have elected into public office, including public officials. And our work also includes sharing information relating to elections and democratic processes in Zimbabwe. We are also looking at how we can expand this into the region, because our view is that there's a contagion effect in terms of how elections have been evolving right across the region. So it's important for us to continue to draw lessons from elections of others, and for others to draw lessons from our own elections, primarily for purposes of ensuring that we strengthen future elections across the region. So this is basically what we do as the Election Resource Center.
Yeah. We have seen quite a number of developments since the beginning of the COVID-19 induced.
Yes.
We've seen the recalling of MPs.
Yes.
Would you say is justice being served on the electorate?
Now that's a difficult question to take. It goes back to what the law says and whether the practice that we're seeing is consistent with what the law provides for. So what has made the COVID-induced recalls that we've seen over the last couple of months has been the fact that the recalls have been made by a political party which contested the 2018 election as an individual political party, and that same political party is now instituting recalls on another political party which it stood against. So we have sought clarity, before I come to the question whether this serves the voter right. We have sought clarity from the Speaker of Parliament and from the President of the Senate, requesting that they furnish Zimbabweans, they furnish the electorate, and they furnish ourselves as an interested party in elections with details on how they arrived at the decision to allow the recalls to happen. We've further also sought clarification from the Election Commission. As you will note, the bulk of those recalls have in fact affected senators, proportional representation, MPs, as compared to how it has affected directly elected members of parliament. So we've sought clarity from the Election Commission, because the bulk of these recalls are not compelling a by-election. So somebody has to appoint replacements. And we have said to the Election Commission they need to clarify in terms of who has the right to fill the vacancies given the recalls that have happened. And from both the Election Commission and the Speaker of Parliament and the leader of the President of the Senate, we've not yet received a response. But what we know in terms of the Electoral Act is that once the recall has been approved, and the Speaker announces the recall, the President has 14 days to proclaim a vacancy, which should then trigger the gazetting of the by-election by the Election Commission. And 14 days after the recalls, the President has not proclaimed a vacancy. Unfortunately, our law is also silent on what happens if the President does not then proclaim the vacancy. But the real controversy around this issue is, in our view, the failure to comply with what the law actually does say. And that to us is a very worrying trend in terms of the future of credible elections in Zimbabwe. If we can't follow our own laws and we allow practices that are inconsistent with the laws, then chances are high that the credibility of our elections will always be under scrutiny, and it contributes to disputed elections. Whether citizens are being shortchanged or not, I think it's fair to say citizens are not being fairly treated, broadly speaking, in terms of the whole concept of recalls. But that's a matter that is derived from what the Constitution says. Our position is that just for purposes of safeguarding the role of the citizen, it may be essential for us to consider how we can look at amending the Electoral Act to put more flesh to how recalls can happen. So currently, the use of recalls is primarily based on what the Constitution says. And it may not be enough. So in other countries, we've seen electoral acts that have been amended to now say, while political parties that feel that they are no longer being sufficiently represented by somebody who was elected via their ticket, the same political parties must seek the opinion of affected voters. In some instances, we have noted that the political party will actually require 50% of registered voters in a particular constituency to concede and agree with the party that indeed this person can be recalled. These are some of the ways we think, and we are continuing to propose to say, look, if our intention is really to protect the voter, let's try and ensure that we look at how we can strengthen the Electoral Act. So that the practice of recalling is not as easy as we have seen it. But just to reinforce the controversy around the recent recalls affecting the official opposition is that the party that is calling for the recalls, in some legal opinions, has no right to be recalling members of parliament from their opponents in the 2018 elections. And that clarity to us would be important to be provided for by the Speaker of Parliament, by the leader of the Senate, in terms of explaining how they arrived at that decision, because it's an administrative decision. And in terms of the Constitution, whenever an administrative decision has been made, there's a responsibility on the part of those making that decision to give reasons why they took that decisions to the voters. So at the very elementary level, they need to give us that clarification. Secondly, the Election Commission has got to further clarify who of all the parties now has the right to appoint replacements following the recalls. Thirdly, the president has to comply with the laws. If the law says that he must then proclaim within 14 days, notwithstanding COVID, he must comply. And then it would be fair enough for the Election Commission to then say, notwithstanding the proclamation by the president for the by-elections to happen, we are of course still under COVID. And the space, the environment does not allow us to then go for elections, but at least we would have seen some level of compliance with the laws. And when you're looking at elections, broadly speaking, you will find that failure to comply with the laws in some instances can actually invalidate some of the administrative things that we've been seeing with respect to elections. So we're encouraging full compliance with the law, we're encouraging administrative decisions to be explained to the voters, we're encouraging the further strengthening of laws, and there we're not asking for amendments to the Constitution, we're just asking for the Electoral Act to be strengthened so that the citizen voice is protected when it comes to issues such as recalls.
There's been talk that they need to bypass the by-election and appoint legislators who have been recalled.
Yeah.
And is that possible under the current
law? No, not under the current law. Not under the current law. And not under the current Electoral Act. You can only do that for proportional representation senators. And remember, the allocation of proportional representative senators and members of parliament is on the basis of the proportion of the vote that a particular political party got. So you're looking at each of these members that have been recalled is from the PR list, having been seconded to those positions based on the number of votes that a particular party got. So you can only replace those people on the basis of the votes that the party got in 2018. Now, to then argue to say that it will be possible to simply appoint replacements for members of parliament that have been recalled, and about 4 or 5 of such seats, and I know Zanu-PF recently also recalled one of their parliamentarians. So we've got 5 by-elections that should happen. And we know that the president hasn't proclaimed these 14 days, within 14 days of the announcement by the speaker. So under the current law, it would be impossible to simply appoint replacements for those 5 or so that have been affected by the recalls. We need to have by-elections, and it's an opportunity for citizens to be represented. So the longer we wait and we delay this, the more devastating the impact is on the voters, because they can't be represented. And we know currently there are legislative processes that are happening where you would require representation. So what happens to those communities where members of parliament have been recalled, and they could be debating issues of national importance, the budget, how resources are being managed under COVID, the parliamentary portfolio committee system which allows oversight. So there's no representation that is happening for these communities, and these communities must take up that matter with the relevant institutions so that their voices are heard. The president has got to proclaim the by-elections. The election commission has to let us know who will replace, but for anyone to imagine that they can immediately appoint replacements of directly elected members of parliament, that's it's not provided for in terms of the law. You would actually need amendments both to the Electoral Act and to the Constitution for you to be able to do that.
Under the current environment,
yeah.
Is it conducive to the elections?
Now, again, a very difficult question to raise, and I'll address it in 2 parts. You see, the current conditions for elections in Zimbabwe are defined by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also, on the second part, they're defined by the political environment, and the political environment marked by the absence of reforms. So the dilemma that we have as a country is, which one of the two is a threat to our elections? Is it COVID on its own? Is it the issue of reforms? So on our part as the Election Resource Center, the position we took was that, look, when the pandemic came, it was impossible for us to conduct credible elections, because when you look at statutory instrument 81, 82, I'm not sure which one it was, which came up with the lockdown provisions, there was restrictions in movement. There are restrictions in terms of association, electoral participation, where there is restrictions in movement, where there are restrictions in association, and some elements of restrictions in expression. Definitely people cannot freely express themselves at the poll. And we understand that under a lockdown situation, there is limited access to information. So on one end, these were crucial issues that we felt could negatively affect the conduct of credible elections, because our position is that when you look at elections, it's not just a matter of conducting elections. They have to be free, they have to be fair. So clearly COVID posed a threat. But at the same time, we also felt that preparing for COVID without preparing for credible elections would equally be problematic for us. So on the 2 fronts, in terms of COVID and in terms of reforms, we have felt that Zimbabwe was not ready for elections. Even before COVID came, our position was that why do we continue to rush to by-elections if we're not implementing reforms? I mean, we had elections in 2018. There were clearly stipulated areas of concern, which have been confirmed as problematic by various observers that were invited and accredited to observe our elections. And we've done very little in terms of addressing those challenges. So why were we rushing to by-elections? So the hope was that as we consider how we can still have credible, free and fair elections under COVID, we also consider how we can implement reforms so that our elections find greater meaning in terms of their benefit to the voter. And the sad reality is that we have opted to focus more on COVID and not on the issue of reforms. And it has set a very bad precedence. Now we are looking at a situation where we are now being told that the Election Commission is ready to resume conducting elections. But in everything that has happened, there has not been an emphasis around how the future conduct of elections will reinforce issues of transparency and accountability, things that were problematic in the last election. How conducting future elections will be positively impacted around the issue of the independence of the Electoral Commission. How election laws will be fully aligned with the Constitution. We've not touched on those things. So it may be naive on our part to think that coming up with a COVID policy on election will make Zimbabwe ready to conduct elections under COVID. Because the threat to our elections is not just COVID. The threat to elections in Zimbabwe includes the absence of reforms. So we must be prepared to be honest with ourselves, to say, look, yes, COVID probably gave us a reprieve. So we had an opportunity to reflect. But have we sufficiently used that opportunity to reflect, to then consider how we can strengthen elections beyond COVID? Because we accept COVID is our new reality. It's not going anywhere. So it's important to consider it. But equally, Zimbabweans are not looking forward to just elections for the sake of elections. Zimbabweans are looking forward to free, fair and credible elections as defined by the Constitution. So what steps have we taken to eliminate issues that have compromised the freeness, fairness and credibility of our elections, notwithstanding the fact that COVID is there? So it may be premature for us to say, now we're ready for elections, let's go for elections, if we haven't addressed the reform issues. And as the ERC, we have repeatedly, ahead of the 2013 elections, we said the same thing. Ahead of the 2018 elections, we equally said the same thing. We can't rush to elections because they are due, when we haven't yet dealt with issues of reforms. And we must be honest with ourselves. And in our thinking, the Election Commission is well within its mandate to say the environment is not conducive. We can't hold elections because we can't hold them in the manner that is prescribed by the Constitution. But we have not seen the Election Commission come out and say this. So our encouragement to them is that they have to assert themselves and say, apart from just holding elections for the sake of elections, when it comes to elections, because this is about the citizens' voice. And the environment in which citizens are expressing themselves is important. The quality of these elections are important. And until we start hearing ourselves talking about the qualitative aspects of our elections, which are crucial to ensure that each vote counts, we have not yet started. So it may be naive on our part to say, if we are able to allow for social distancing, if we are able to allow for sanitization, if we are able to go virtual in terms of nomination forms and for people to inspect the voters' roll, we are ready for elections under COVID. We are not. Because in all these elements, we have still not said, how are we going to make our results transmission more transparent? How are we going to make the printing of ballots more transparent and verifiable? How are we going to make the recruitment of election officials more transparent and accountable? How are we going to make our results of elections more verifiable? Because these are elements that are reinforced in the Constitution, and these are areas where our elections have been disputed. Our elections have not been disputed because of health matters. They have been disputed because of the qualitative aspects in the manner in which elections are conducted. So we need to be honest with ourselves and say, if we're going to move forward, let's consider COVID, yes, but also let's consider the qualitative aspects that will strengthen future elections in a manner that builds public confidence in elections. So the question to say, are we ready for elections under COVID? We may be ready in terms of public health issues, but we're not ready in terms of free, fair and credible elections, because we haven't yet started moving on issues of electoral reforms.
Lastly, you alluded to SIE 81 indictment. Has the parliament played its role in the processes of SIE?
No, there's been debate to say, look, over the last 300 or so days, we have had an almost equal number of statutory instruments as a country. And it raises questions around whether the executive has indeed hijacked the legislative role of parliament. And I think that question is a justifiable one. Where is the exercise of oversight over what the executive is doing? So we've seen a lot of decisions being made by the executive, and there could be legal arguments to argue that the executive must run the country. But if we are a democracy, of which Zimbabwe we claim to be a democracy, it would be equally important to say, look, where is the executive accounting to? And a system that does not have strong mechanisms of accountability opens up opportunities for possible abuse of authority. And this is the dilemma that we've got. So our encouragement to Parliament has been to say, look, Parliament has got to be more assertive in terms of exercising oversight over the executive. And this includes reviewing some of these statutory instruments, the decisions that the executive is taking. The executive can't rule on its own. And there's been an argument to say we won the election so we can rule. But that's not how democracy works. Even when you have won an election, you must account. That's what good governance is about. A responsible leadership, a responsible executive must be one that submits itself to oversight. And we have not yet seen that. So there are real questions that are being asked at the end of the day. And our encouragement to Parliament has been to say they need to be more assertive, but also to the executive to say, look, you, in as much as you won and you have argued to say you've got the mandate to lead, it's going to be important for your leadership to be exposed to mechanisms of accountability, and Parliament is one such mechanism. So even if we're under COVID, we know that the oversight role of parliaments right across the world has not been undermined. There are ways in which people have continued to work and discharge their constitutional mandates in a manner that is secure under COVID. Why are we not doing that? And the pandemic is an important issue to consider, of course. And we know that there's agency in dealing with some of the issues. But such dealing with issues must be done in an accountable manner. We've not seen that. So it's again a very dangerous precedence that we are seeing as a country. And if we want our democracy to work, we need to be able to strengthen our institutions so that there's separation of powers, there's accountability in how we are led as a people. And this is our plea, both to Parliament and to the executive, to say, look, there has to be a compliance with the democratic tenets. We can't be run on the basis of statutory instruments whose review is not subject to the representative of the people. The people must actively participate in the making of laws. The Constitution says that. But we can't do that if we are being governed through statutory instruments which are not subject to review by Parliament. So every decision that the executive is making must be subject to review by Parliament. And Parliament has got to reassure us as citizens that they're in a position to do this and they will do it on behalf of us as citizens. We have not yet seen this happening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
For these and other stories, visit our website www.263chat.com. Follow us on Twitter @263chat and like our Facebook page 263chat.